introduce our second keynote, Jose Bravo. Jose is the Executive Director for the Just Transition Alliance, which was founded in 1997. Mr. Bravo's work in social justice issues is rooted from his upbringing in the Southern California fields alongside both his parents. He has also worked on immigrant rights issues since his days as a student organizer in the 80s. He is recognized as a national and international leader in the environmental justice movement. His current work involves chemical policy and green chemistry work at a statewide level with the Californians for a Healthy and Green Economy Change, an alliance of health, environmental, labor, resource organizations, and EJ organizations throughout California. He works with the Safer Chemicals Healthy Families campaign to address EJ concerns in the reform of the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. He serves as an advisor to the Environmental Justice and Health Alliance on Chemical Policies at the Safer Chemicals Healthy Families Coalition. Jose's talk is entitled Addressing Environmental Justice Through Chemical Policy. Welcome, Jose.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about the environmental justice approach to what we just heard and what has been happening throughout the United States and in many other countries too, and that's chemical reform and the fact that a lot of the chemicals that we're trying to get out of the market are fat mimicking chemicals, such as the ones that you saw on the last presentation. But first I want to set the context on environmental justice. The United States Environmental Protection Agency says that environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement, let's keep that word in mind, of environmental laws and regulations. Their definition goes on to say that fair treatment means that no group of people, including racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic groups, should bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, municipal, commercial operations or the execution of federal, state, and local tribal and tribal programs and policies. So I don't know if people have seen the television this morning or have looked at the news, but the EPA is getting a big bashing this morning by a lot of the Republican folks that are working their way to try to get to be president of the United States. And in the environmental justice movement, we've had basically a love-hate relationships with the Environmental Protection Agency. And I'll say that one of the failures of the US EPA and other governmental agencies is the fact that environmental justice communities of color, the communities that these agencies came together and said they were going to protect, have borne a disproportionate impact. And we feel that a lot of these agencies have turned a blind eye on the environmental and economic problem by practicing selective enforcement and racism when it comes to local zoning laws. So how were we able to prove disproportionate impact or exposure? In 1987, a landmark study by the United Church of Christ titled Toxic Waste and Race in the United States basically took a map of the United States and looked at where all the heavy industry was, where all the most polluting industry was, where the toxic landfills and toxic waste incinerators were located, and then superimposed a map of the highest concentrations of people of color. And lo and behold, there was a direct correlation. There was a direct correlation where these facilities were sited. So what does environmental justice have to do with obesogens? So again, we just talked about a high disproportionate exposure. Many of the communities, as I'll speak on later, have a lot of these same facilities, not only one or two or three, but a multitude of these facilities at the fence line. So we believe that there's increased vulnerability, a high likelihood of increased effects. It would probably be safe to say that chemicals play a role in many of our communities' health problems. We know that there's several studies out there that say that blacks have the overall prevalence of obesity of 34.7%. For Latinos, the overall prevalence of obesity is 28.7%. And for whites, the overall prevalence is 23.7%. So here we start seeing obesity. And if we also look at cancer rates, asthma rates, and a bunch of other illnesses that plague a lot of the environmental justice communities, we can also look at now obesity and the rates of obesity in these communities. So we attribute some of that to higher chemical exposure, increased vulnerability factors, and defined environmental injustice. So let's talk about phthalates. In a recent study, 387 Black and Latino youth were tested. Their urine showed 97% were exposed to phthalates. These phthalates are commonly found in personal care products and some coatings in medicines. So let's go back to the issue of disproportionate impact. Chemical plants that produce toxic substances are probably at the fence line again. And many products that are targeted to people of color have high concentrations of these types of chemicals. And here's another kicker. When primarily white communities start advocating for safer products, these products are taken off the local shelves and end up in the 99-cent stores in communities of color and low-income communities. So we need to protect everyone. And what we're asking is that when we talk about chemical policy and policies, that we do not shift the burden to anyone. We need to get rid of the danger. Recently, I was invited to a redirectioning, per se, of a big foundation. As a senior officer commented on how wonderful the First Lady's campaign, Let's Move campaign, was, she ended by saying, let's get off the sofa and go outside and run and play and make healthier food choices. I responded back that I said that this is great news, but we also need to get rid of fat-mimicking chemicals in food. Food containers, mattresses, pillows, blankets, kids' toys, and things made out of PVC. And we need green, healthy spaces to run in. She turned to me and said, "This is not the time to attack the First Lady." So I said I was not attacking the First Lady. I was actually commending her in the fact that she's taken this as an issue. But I wanted her to go further than just saying get up and move. Because if you understand what it is to live in an environmental justice community, our food in the inner cities primarily comes from cans. Fresh vegetables are very, very hard to get a hold of. And our green areas of where we are to get out and run are non-existent. So I think it's very important for us to look a little bit deeper than just make a blanket statement of get up and run and move. So I think our work is cut out. We need to protect the most vulnerable, and we heard today that the most vulnerable are children, and children that are still in the mother's womb. So I wanted to also mention that early in the environmental justice movement, the United States Environmental Protection Agency came out with a report about what they claimed was affecting people of color in environmental justice communities. I think most every page, and it emphasized heavily, was the issue of lifestyle as a condition in regards to asthma, birth defects, and other things of that nature. They didn't take into consideration the multitude of factories, the multitude of companies, the multitude of plants that sometimes aren't regulated, and sometimes are given variances, and in other times are given pollution credits from other states and other areas so that they can maintain the level of pollution and or increase their level of pollution.
Yeah, that's great.
So, like I say, sometimes it's pretty disappointing. But I served on the Obama transition team, and as the environmental justice, as one of the environmental justice representatives. And I went over and over and over these facts with people before they became the heads of EPA, the heads of other folks, when they were being courted by the new administration to come in and take the leadership helm. And some of their aides, I remember sitting in rooms with their aides and saying, we need to address these situations. Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families campaign and others also met, Safer States met with folks, and we went back and forth and said, look, we have to get to the level of prevention. Instead of dealing with the illness, we have to start preventing things from happening. So chemical reform is very important. And I'm going to go over a list of what we see in our communities, and it's one of the same lists that we read off to those folks in these positions. So discount stores selling toxic products, home pesticides, cosmetics and personal care products, BPA in canned foods and drink containers, lead in tire weights, lead in paint, refineries, chemical plants, plastic rubber factories, pharmaceutical plants, industrial or chemical fires and explosions, cement kilns, agricultural pesticides and herbicide manufacturing, toxic release inventory listed facilities, sewage sludge, indoor air contaminants, chemical and pharmaceutical sewage contamination, fish contamination, and on and on and on. So this is what makes this is the makeup of some of the communities that we work in or we live in. And this also makes me remember a dear friend who just recently passed away. Her name is Hazel Johnson, an African-American grandmother from Chicago. She called her neighborhood the Toxic Donut because where she lived, and like many other communities, they were surrounded by toxic waste, toxic emitting facilities, toxics in general, I would say. So that was quite a list. And as I was talking to folks, their response back was, wow, that's a big task. But ultimately, in the environmental justice community, we're not advocating for just us. We're advocating for everyone. So everyone's health needs to come into play here, and everyone's environment needs to come into play. So what do we suggest to people when we talk about how to remove some of these things from your daily life? So we say wash fruits and vegetables. If they can't eat organic, now let me ask you a question. Organic food in environmental justice communities is a rarity. A rarity. And low-fat foods, also a rarity. And organic milk and meats and other things like that, I mean, they're very hard and expensive to get a hold of. We also advocate for people not to use plastic containers when they microwave things. And don't let plastic wrap touch food. Look for BPA-free plastic water bottles and baby bottles. Don't buy PVC plastic containers. Eat fresh, frozen, or glass bottled rather than canned foods and drinks. And pertaining to the environmental justice community, get toxic waste sites cleaned up. Urge government to enforce environmental and health laws. Look at the lifespan of chemicals and ensure that the danger is engineered through green chemistry, which is something that's coming up and is very, very important for us to maintain in our heads as we move forward. And join organizations that work on chemical policy at a federal, state, and local level. And one of those organizations is the Safer Chemicals Healthy Families, and then the Safer States Coalition, like I mentioned. Our strategy is to have chemical policy passed in all 50 states. We've had 36 states proposed chemical legislation. 11 states have passed chemical policy in one form or another. It's very, very important because now the chemical industry, when they come to the table, they see that they could have 50 different laws instead of coming to the table and helping to reform TSCA. TSCA has failed us like you wouldn't imagine. I don't know if people are aware, but there's over 90,000 chemicals, and since 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency has only looked at 200 of those chemicals and authorized only 5 for use. So it has really failed us, and the responsibility is not and shouldn't be on the government. The responsibility should be on the industries to start producing things that are non-toxic and do not pose a threat to both the environment and our health. So with that, thank you very much. And we're going to be up here for questions, I guess.